Some men think everything has a price, until they meet someone who doesn't. The chandelier light shimmered softly across the polished marble floors, reflecting off crystal glasses and tailored suits, but none of it reached Ethan Caldwell's eyes as he sat at the center table, scrolling through his phone with the quiet impatience of a man who had never been made to wait, his Swiss watch ticking in perfect rhythm against his wrist, each second too slow for someone used to controlling outcomes, controlling rooms, controlling people. And yet tonight, something felt slightly off, not wrong, just incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. Across the room, laughter broke out as a woman at another table leaned closer to him earlier, her smile polished, her acceptance immediate, the kind of transaction Ethan had grown accustomed to, simple, efficient, predictable. He had made an offer, she had accepted, and the evening moved forward exactly as expected. But now, as his gaze lifted again, it stopped, not because of noise or movement, but because of absence. The absence of reaction, the absence of interest, the absence of everything he usually inspired. Clara Whitmore moved between tables with steady hands and quiet precision, her posture straight, her expression calm, not cold, not warm, just present, as if she existed in a space untouched by the invisible currency that governed the rest of the room. She didn't rush, didn't linger, didn't perform. And somehow that stillness drew more attention than any laughter or charm ever could. Ethan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then another, his curiosity forming not from attraction, but from disruption. She didn't fit, and that alone made her interesting. When she approached his table, setting down a glass of sparkling water without a word, her movements were efficient, deliberate, her eyes meeting his only briefly before returning to her task. No hesitation, no recognition, no shift in tone, just professionalism stripped of performance. And something about that unsettled him, in a way he couldn't quite define. Most people adjusted when they realized who he was. Their voices softened, their posture changed, their attention sharpened. But Clara remained unchanged, as if his name, his wealth, his presence held no additional weight in her world. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her now, not overtly, but with the quiet focus of a man evaluating a variable he didn't yet understand. "You're new," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, the kind that usually guided conversations without resistance. Clara glanced up, just once, her expression neutral. "No, sir," she replied softly, her tone even, unshaken, and returned to arranging the silverware with precise alignment. The simplicity of her answer landing heavier than it should have. No elaboration, no attempt to engage, just truth, clean and complete. Ethan felt the faintest shift in his chest, not irritation, not yet, just awareness. He had spent years mastering people, understanding patterns, predicting responses, but this lack of pattern, this quiet refusal to participate in the unspoken game, it lingered. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black card, placing it gently on the table between them with the same ease he had done 100 times before, a gesture that had never failed. "Not once." "Tell me," he said, his voice lowering just enough to suggest importance. "What would it take for you to stay after your shift?" The offer hung there, unspoken in numbers but clear in intention, a familiar script, a familiar outcome. Clara's hand paused, just for a fraction of a second, not trembling, not uncertain, simply still. Her eyes moved to the card, then back to him, and in that brief silence, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to make Ethan lean forward without realizing it. Waiting, expecting, because this was the moment where everything usually aligned, where the world returned to its predictable order, where people became understandable again. But Clara didn't reach for the card, didn't smile, didn't react the way he expected. Instead, she looked at him fully. Now, her gaze steady, calm, and for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell felt something unfamiliar. Not rejection, not yet, but the quiet suggestion that whatever came next would not follow his rules. Clara did not move her hand toward the card, not even a fraction of an inch, and that absence of motion stretched longer than Ethan expected, long enough for the low murmur of the restaurant to return around them, long enough for the quiet clink of silverware and distant laughter to feel suddenly louder. As if the world had resumed while his moment remained suspended, she tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in observation, as though she were studying something far more complex than the offer itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying no edge, no hesitation. "Do you always begin with the number?" she asked softly, her eyes steady on his. And for a brief second, Ethan did not answer, not because he could not, but because the question did not fit the script he had expected. He leaned back slightly, regaining his composure, the faintest hint of a smile returning to his lips. "It saves time," he replied, his tone light, almost amused, as if the logic were obvious, as if efficiency were a virtue no one could question. Clara nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging the answer without agreeing to it, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, still far from the card. "It probably does," she said, her voice even. "When time is all you think you are spending." The words landed quietly, without force, but something in them lingered, subtle, like a note slightly out of tune. Ethan studied her more closely now, the faint smile fading into something sharper, more focused. "And what do you think I am spending?" he asked, his voice lower, more deliberate, no longer playing, no longer assuming control without effort. Clara glanced down at the card again, then back at him, her expression unchanged. "That depends," she replied. "Do you know what you are trying to buy?" The question hung between them, simple, direct, and completely disarming. Ethan felt the shift more clearly now, not in the room, not in the atmosphere, but in himself, a subtle disruption in the certainty he carried so effortlessly. He had asked thousands of questions in his life, negotiated deals worth millions, navigated conversations with precision, but this felt different, because for the first time, the answer was not obvious. He exhaled quietly, leaning forward just enough to rest his forearms on the table, his attention no longer divided, no longer casual. "I think I am offering an opportunity," he said, choosing his words carefully now, as if they mattered more than before. Clara's gaze softened, not with warmth, but with understanding, as though she had heard that answer many times. "An opportunity for who?" she asked, and again. The simplicity of the question cut deeper than any challenge ever had. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then paused, the words forming but not quite settling, because beneath the surface, something felt incomplete, like a calculation missing a variable. Clara watched him for a moment, not impatient, not pressing, simply present, allowing the silence to do what her words had already begun. And when she spoke again, it was quieter, almost reflective. "You see a moment," she said, "something you can shape, define, control." Her fingers tapped lightly once against the table, a small, precise movement. "I see a person deciding what that moment is worth." She straightened slightly, her posture unchanged but somehow more grounded, more certain. And those are not the same thing. Ethan felt it then, not as a sharp realization, but as a slow, steady shift, like a lens coming into focus. The card on the table suddenly looked different, not powerful, not decisive, just incomplete. He glanced down at it briefly, then back at her, and for the first time that evening, he did not reach for it, did not adjust it, did not reinforce its presence, because something in him understood, quietly, unmistakably, that whatever this moment was becoming, it could not be measured in the way he had always known. The silence did not break all at once. It settled, slowly, deliberately, like a weight neither of them rushed to lift. Ethan's fingers rested against the edge of the table, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, just still, as if the rhythm he had always relied on had quietly disappeared. Clara did not fill the space. She did not look away either, her presence steady, unforced, allowing the moment to exist without direction. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because he was used to movement, to progress, to outcomes that could be shaped with the right words at the right time. But here, there was no clear next step, only a pause that seemed to stretch deeper the longer it remained. He let out a slow breath, barely noticeable, his gaze shifting briefly to the card again before returning to her. "You are different," he said finally, the words simple, almost understated, but carrying a quiet acknowledgement he did not often give. Clara's expression did not change, not in surprise, not in satisfaction, just a slight tilt of her head, as if she had heard something familiar, something expected. "No," she replied gently. "I just do not respond the way you expect." The correction was subtle, but precise, and it landed with a clarity that made Ethan pause again. Because she was not claiming to be exceptional, she was pointing to his assumption, not her. Difference, he leaned back in his chair, his posture shifting, not defensive, not relaxed, just reconsidering. "Most people would have picked that up already," he said, nodding toward the card, his tone no longer testing, more observational now. Clara followed his glance briefly, then looked back at him. "Most people are trying to solve a problem," she said, her voice calm. "And sometimes money looks like the fastest answer." She placed her hand lightly on the table, still not touching the card. "But not every moment is a problem that needs solving." Ethan felt something in that sentence settle deeper than the others, something quieter, more personal. He had built his life on solving problems, identifying gaps, filling them with precision, speed, efficiency. It was how he measured success, how he measured value. And yet here, in a moment that required nothing from him, no decision, no action, no control, he found himself searching for a response that did not feel rehearsed. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "Then what is this moment?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier confidence that had carried it so easily. Clara held his gaze, her answer coming without delay. "A choice," she said simply. "Not about the offer," she added, her tone steady, "but about how you see the person in front of you." The words did not accuse, they did not challenge, they revealed, and that made them harder to dismiss. Ethan sat with that, truly sat with it. For the first time that evening, he was not thinking ahead, not calculating the next move, not anticipating the outcome. He was just present, and in that presence, something became clear, not fully formed, not yet understood, but undeniable. The card on the table was no longer a solution. It was a reflection, a representation of a pattern he had never questioned, never needed to question, until now. He reached forward slowly, not to offer it again, not to emphasize it, but to slide it back toward himself. The movement quiet, almost unnoticeable. Clara's eyes followed it for a brief second, then returned to him, her expression unchanged. But there was something there now, not approval, not relief, just recognition, as if a small, unseen line had been crossed. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his voice softer when he spoke again. "And if I choose differently," he said, not as a challenge, but as a question he was genuinely asking. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then you might see something you have been missing," she replied, her tone gentle, certain. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not feel like the most powerful person in the room, and strangely, that did not feel like a loss. The moment did not end. It deepened, settling into something quieter than conversation and heavier than silence. Ethan remained still for a few seconds longer, his hand now resting away from the card, no longer using it as an extension of himself, no longer needing it to define the space between them. And for the first time that evening, he looked at Clara not as a variable to understand, not as a reaction to predict, but simply as a person standing in front of him, complete without his interpretation, complete without his influence. And that realization shifted something fundamental, subtle but undeniable. "What is it that I am missing?" he asked finally, his voice no longer carrying the quiet authority it once held. But something else, something more open. Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not have one, but because she seemed to weigh the moment, as if deciding whether the question was real or just another version of control disguised as curiosity. Her eyes softened slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity. "You are not missing something," she said, her tone calm, measured. "You are just not used to seeing it." Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought, his mind moving through the sentence, trying to place it within the structures he understood, but it did not fit neatly. It did not resolve quickly, and that alone held his attention. Clara reached for the check presenter at the edge of the table, her movements smooth, deliberate, as if returning the moment back to its original purpose. But before she placed it down, she paused, just briefly, her fingers resting lightly against the leather cover. You walk into a room, she continued, her voice quiet enough that it did not travel beyond the table. And everything adjusts to you. People shift, conversations change, attention follows, not because they know you, but because they know what you represent. She met his gaze again, steady, unwavering. So you learn to read those reactions as truth. Ethan felt that land, not sharply, not painfully, but with a weight that lingered longer than expected, because it was not an accusation. It was an observation, and that made it harder to dismiss. He leaned back slightly, his breath slower now, more measured. And you do not, he said, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of the difference she had already shown. Clara gave a faint, almost invisible smile, not directed at him, but at the simplicity of the question. I see what is there before it changes, she replied, placing the check gently on the table, not as an ending, but as a quiet continuation of the moment. Ethan's eyes dropped briefly to the check, then returned to her, and something shifted again, deeper this time, because he understood now that this was not about the offer, not about acceptance or rejection. It was about perception, about the way he had always approached the world, and how that approach shaped everything he thought he understood. So what do you see now? He asked, his voice softer, more careful, as if the answer mattered in a way he had not anticipated. Clara held his gaze for a second longer than before, her expression unchanged, but her presence more defined, more grounded. I see someone who is deciding whether to keep things the same, she said quietly, or to finally notice that they do not have to be. The words settled between them, not demanding a response, not expecting one, just existing as a possibility. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing in a way they had not all evening, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to respond immediately, did not feel the need to control where this went next, because something in him recognized that this moment, this quiet exchange, was not something to be directed, it was something to be understood. He reached for the check, not out of habit, not out of routine, but with intention, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action carried more meaning than before. Clara stepped back slightly, giving him space, not stepping away from the moment, but allowing it to belong to him now. And as Ethan Caldwell looked down at the check, then back up at her, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to buy an outcome, he was trying to understand one. And that difference, small as it seemed, felt like the beginning of something he had never learned how to measure. The check rested in Ethan's hand longer than it needed to, not because he was calculating the total, but because for once, the number did not feel like the most important part of the moment. His thumb traced the edge of the paper slowly, almost absent-mindedly, as his thoughts moved somewhere unfamiliar, not forward, not toward the next meeting or decision, but inward, toward something he had not paused to examine in years. Clara remained nearby, not hovering, not watching, simply present in the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, her attention shifting naturally between tables, her movements unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and that, more than anything, made the moment feel real, because it was not marked by spectacle or reaction, just a subtle shift that only he seemed to feel. He placed the check back on the table, not reaching for his wallet immediately, his gaze lifting to find her again as she passed by. Clara, he said, the name coming more naturally this time, not as a label, but as recognition. She paused, turning toward him with the same calm composure. Yes, sir, she replied, though the formality now felt lighter, less defined by distance. Ethan hesitated, just briefly, the pause not from uncertainty, but from choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. Do you ever take anything from moments like this? He asked, his voice quieter, more reflective. Clara studied him for a second, not surprised by the question, but attentive to it, as if it mattered that he was asking. I take what is actually there, she said simply, not what someone tries to turn it into. Ethan nodded slowly, the answer settling in without resistance, because it did not challenge him. It clarified something he had overlooked. His hand moved toward his wallet then, but the motion felt different now, not automatic, not transactional. He placed his card inside the folder, closing it gently, not as a signal of completion, but as part of a process he was finally present for. Clara reached for it with the same steady movement, her fingers brushing the edge briefly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said, not in the way he had expected at the beginning of the evening. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze following her as she walked away, not out of curiosity now, but out of awareness, noticing the way she moved through the room without adjusting to it, without needing it to acknowledge her, and something about that stayed with him, not as admiration, but as a quiet realization that had been too focused to notice before. When Clara returned, placing the receipt on the table, Ethan glanced at it only briefly before looking up at her. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but carrying a sincerity that had not been there earlier. Clara gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding a quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood that the words meant more than they usually did. Ethan signed the receipt, his pen moving slower than usual, not rushed, not distracted, and when he set it down, he did not add anything more, no extra gesture, no attempt to redefine the moment again, just completion, clean and unembellished. Clara took the folder, her movements as steady as before, and for a second, their eyes met again, not as strangers, not as roles, but as two people who had shared something neither of them needed to explain. She turned and walked away, returning to the rhythm of her work, and Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table, his watch still ticking, but no longer setting the pace of his thoughts, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next, he was thinking about what had just happened, and more importantly, what it revealed, not about her, but about himself. And as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a movement that felt more habitual than necessary, he realized that he had not lost control of the moment. He had simply stopped trying to control it. And in that space, something far more valuable had taken its place, something he could not measure, could not buy, but could not ignore either. The night air outside felt different when Ethan stepped out, not colder, not quieter, just clearer, as if something inside him had adjusted and the world followed in response. The city lights stretched across the street in long reflections on the polished surfaces of passing cars, and for once, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the next meeting, did not calculate the minutes lost or gained. He simply stood there for a moment, his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze unfocused, replaying not the words, but the pauses between them, the way Clara had. Never rushed to fill the silence, never tried to guide the outcome, and somehow, that restraint had said more than anything he had encountered in years. His driver pulled up to the curb, the familiar black sedan stopping with quiet precision, the door opening as expected, as everything in his life usually did. But Ethan did not move immediately. He glanced back once, through the glass front of the restaurant, catching a glimpse of her inside, moving between tables with the same calm rhythm, unchanged, unaffected by whatever had shifted in him. And that was the part he could not ignore, because it meant the moment had not been about her proving something. It had been about him seeing something. He stepped into the car finally, settling into the leather seat, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound. His driver waited, eyes forward. "Home, sir?" he asked, and for the first time, Ethan hesitated. Not because he did not know the answer, but because the routine suddenly felt automatic, incomplete. "No," he said after a brief pause, his voice calm but different. "Just drive." The car moved smoothly into traffic, blending into the steady flow of the city, and Ethan leaned back, his head resting lightly against the seat, his eyes drifting to the window as the lights passed by in slow, shifting patterns. His mind did not jump ahead like it usually did. It stayed with the evening, with the questions he had not answered, the assumptions he had never questioned, and the quiet certainty in Clara's voice when she spoke about seeing things as they were, not as they changed for him. He thought about how many rooms he had walked into, how many conversations had been around him, how many people had adjusted before he even spoke, and for the first time, he wondered how much of what he thought he understood had been shaped by that adjustment, how much had been filtered through reactions that were never entirely real. His reflection appeared faintly in the window, weight of his name, without the influence of his position, just a person sitting in the back of a car, thinking about a conversation that had not followed any of his rules, and yet had left a deeper impression than any negotiation or deal he had closed in years. The car slowed at a red light, the city pausing briefly around him, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture as something settled into place, not a conclusion, not a resolution, but an awareness. Something he could not undo now that he had seen it, something that would follow him into every room, every conversation, every decision, not loudly, not forcefully, but quietly, persistently, like a question that no longer needed to be asked out loud. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward again, Ethan Caldwell realized that for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about what he could offer the world. He was thinking about how he saw it, and how much that had shaped everything he believed was real. The car came to a quiet stop in front of his building, the glass facade rising above him in clean, sharp lines that reflected the city lights like a mirror of everything he had built, everything he controlled. And yet, as the door opened and he stepped out, that sense of control felt different, not diminished, but no longer absolute. The lobby doors slid open automatically, the familiar warmth and polished silence greeting him as they always did. But tonight, he noticed things he usually ignored. The way the concierge straightened slightly when he entered, the subtle shift in posture from the security guard, the quiet acknowledgement that followed him without a word. And for the first time, he did not move past it unconsciously. He saw it clearly, the adjustments, the invisible recalibrations that happened around him before he even spoke. And instead of accepting it as normal, he paused, just for a fraction of a second longer than usual. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," the concierge said with a polite nod, and Ethan returned it, not automatically, but intentionally. "Good evening," he replied, his voice calm, but softer than before. The elevator ride was silent, the numbers lighting up one by one as the car ascended, and he watched them without impatience, without checking his watch, without reaching for his phone, as if the time it took to reach the top floor was no longer something to be minimized, but something to simply move through. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched ahead, quiet, controlled, every detail exactly as it had always been, and yet, it did not feel the same, because he was not seeing it the same way. His apartment door opened with a soft click, revealing the wide, open space beyond, the city skyline framed perfectly by floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that had once represented success, clarity, perspective, but tonight, it felt like something else, something more distant, more observational. He walked in slowly, setting his keys down with a quiet, deliberate motion, his jacket following, draped over the back of a chair without the usual precision, his movements less about order now, more about presence. He crossed the room toward the window, stopping just short of the glass, the city stretching out below him in a grid of light and motion, endless, dynamic, alive. And for a moment, he simply stood there, not analyzing, not planning, just watching, the reflection of his own figure faint against the glass, layered over the movement outside. And he found himself looking at that reflection, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with curiosity, as if seeing someone he had known for years, but never truly observed. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, a familiar interruption, a reminder of the world that operated on schedules and outcomes and immediate responses. But he did not turn, did not reach for it. The sound faded into the background, just another piece of noise he chose not to engage with, because something else held his attention now, something quieter, something Clara had said without saying directly, about seeing things before they changed, about recognizing the difference between what is presented and what is real. And as he stood there, Ethan realized how rarely he had allowed himself to simply see, without influence, without expectation, without the constant need to shape what came next. His hand lifted slightly, resting against the cool surface of the glass, the city lights reflecting back at him. And in that moment, there was no deal to close, no decision to finalize, no outcome to secure, just a simple, unfamiliar awareness that not everything in front of him needed to be controlled to be understood. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried a weight that stayed with him long after the city continued moving below, unchanged, while something within him had already begun to shift. The night stretched quietly around him, not demanding anything, not asking to be shaped or directed, just existing in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely steady. Ethan remained by the window longer than he realized, his reflection fading in and out against the shifting lights below. And when he finally stepped back, it was not with urgency, not with a plan, but with a subtle sense that something inside him had not finished unfolding. His phone buzzed again, this time longer, more insistent, and he turned toward it slowly, not out of habit, but with intention. The screen lit up with messages, emails, updates, the constant stream that had once defined his rhythm, and he looked at them differently now, not as priorities, but as noise waiting to be filtered. His thumb hovered over the screen, then lowered without opening anything. The silence that followed felt deliberate, chosen, and he set the phone down. Untouched, the room around him remained still, expansive, almost too quiet for someone used to movement. But instead of filling it, he let it remain, moving through the space without purpose, his footsteps soft against the floor, his mind not racing ahead, but lingering in the space between thoughts. Clara's voice returned, not in exact words, but in presence, in the way she had never tried to lead the moment, never tried to become something more or less than what she was. And that simplicity carried weight now, because it revealed how much effort he had always put into shaping perception, controlling outcomes, defining interactions before they even began. He stopped near the table where his phone rested, glancing at it briefly, then past it, his attention drawn instead to the small details around him, the untouched glass of water, the neatly arranged documents, the precision of a life built on structure and clarity. And for the first time, he wondered how much of that clarity had been constructed, how much had been adjusted to fit a narrative he had accepted without question. His hand moved toward the back of a chair, resting there lightly, grounding himself in the moment, not as a strategy, but as a choice. The city continued outside, unchanged, the same patterns, the same movement, the same constant flow, but his perspective had shifted just enough to make it feel different, not distant, not disconnected, but less controlled, less defined by his place within it. He walked back toward the window once more, not drawn by the view, but by the reflection it offered. And this time, when he looked at himself, he did not see a role, not a title, not a position, just a person standing still in a moment he had not tried to shape. And that stillness held something he could not ignore, something that did not need to be solved or improved or leveraged, just understood, slowly, quietly. Over time, his breath settled into a steady rhythm, matching nothing but itself. And in that quiet, something became clear, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, that what he had experienced was not a disruption, not an anomaly, but a glimpse of something he had overlooked, something that existed outside of transactions and expectations, something that required presence instead of control. And as the city lights continued their silent movement beyond the glass, Ethan Caldwell stood there, no longer trying to define what the moment meant, but allowing it to remain exactly as it was, knowing that for once, that was enough. Morning arrived without announcement, the first light of day slipping quietly through the glass and stretching across the floor in long, soft lines. And for once, Ethan did not wake to the sharp pull of obligation or the immediate reach for his phone. He opened his eyes slowly, aware not of what needed to be done, but of where he was, of the stillness that remained from the night before. Untouched, uninterrupted, his gaze moved toward the window, the city now calmer, less defined by lights and more by shape and motion. And as he sat up, the absence of urgency felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. He stood, moving through his apartment with the same deliberate pace he had discovered the night before, each action grounded, intentional, not rushed toward the next. His phone remained on the table where he had left it, silent now, waiting, but no longer commanding. He paused beside it for a moment, then walked past, choosing instead to pour a glass of water, the simple act carrying more presence than it ever had before. He took a slow sip, his eyes drifting back to the skyline. And in that quiet, Clara's words returned, not as a memory, but as something integrated, something that had already begun to reshape the way he noticed the world around him. Later, as he stepped outside, the air felt different in the daylight, clearer, less filtered, the streets already alive with movement, people walking with purpose, conversations overlapping, the rhythm of the city continuing as it always did. But Ethan did not move through it the same way. His steps were steady, but not hurried, his gaze lifting, observing not just direction, but detail, The way people interacted without awareness of who was watching. The way moments existed before they were influenced, and for the first time, he saw them, clearly, without needing to define them. His car waited at the curb, the driver stepping out as expected, but Ethan raised a hand slightly, a small gesture that paused the routine. "I will walk," he said simply, his voice calm, and the driver nodded, stepping back without question. Ethan continued down the sidewalk, blending into the movement instead of leading it, his presence no longer shifting the space around him in the same way. Or perhaps, he was simply noticing it differently. He passed storefronts, quiet conversations, unnoticed exchanges, and something about that felt grounding, real in a way that did not need to be measured or controlled. When he reached the corner, he paused briefly, the restaurant visible down the block, unchanged, familiar, and yet carrying a different weight now, not as a place, but as a moment that had revealed something he could not unsee. He did not go in, not because he avoided it, but because he did not need to repeat it. The understanding remained without the setting, without the conversation. He turned instead, continuing down the street, his reflection briefly catching in a passing window. And for a moment, he saw it again, not a title, not a position, just a person moving forward without trying to shape every outcome ahead. And that was enough, not because it answered every